intros again. My name is Jocelyn Scudder. I'm the Executive Director of the Arts Council for Park City and Summit County. These virtual community convenings we've been hosting since 2018, right, Jake? And sometimes they've been in person. Since COVID, we've been running them virtually. And while there is drawbacks of holding something virtually, you don't have maybe the personal connection that we normally have. From an accessibility standpoint, we've found that we actually get great participation and it is easier for people to join. And we get to expand some of our, invites to people, like Mariam, who are far, far away and wouldn't be able to come to Park City, and they could shed some light on arts and culture with us. So always silver linings, and we're thrilled to have her. Just to do some quick housekeeping, this is a traditional Zoom, as you probably noticed. It is not a webinar. And that's intentional because these are meant to, again, it's called a community convening, right? So a big part of this, and really kind of what the core of this meeting and event is supposed to be, is community discussion. And so we're going to just give some quick background and introductions. Mariam will get into her presentation. And then a big part of this is going to be inviting all of you to respond to Mariam's presentation. What inspired you? What is applicable to our community here in Summit County? And that conversation is kind of where the magic happens. And so we can't really achieve that in a webinar fashion because people can't engage as easily. So all of you are just here, and I know that you have capabilities to have your mic and your video on. We do recommend, as you've already learned the etiquette over the years, to keep your mic off and your video off unless prompted to unmic or on video. Maybe when we're doing some of our Q&A and some of our discussion, feel free to kind of pop on, say hi, and ask your questions. But for now, and especially during Mariam's conversation, we're going to ask you to stay muted and with your video off. Another thing to mention is if you need closed captioning or are interested, we do have live transcript running, and or if you don't want it and it's on your screen, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen and you press the 3 dots that say more, you can turn live transcript closed captioning on or off. So feel free to use your preferences in that, but it is available. This meeting is being recorded, and we will put it on our website as soon as it's ready to go. So if you have a colleague or a friend that would like to listen in, we will have this archived on our website so that you can visit back and watch it another time. We'll ask you to use the chat and have questions. You can use it throughout the webinar, or sorry, it's not a webinar, throughout the meeting. But we will not get to them until the end of Mariam's presentation, but we can use them as prompts as we go. So as questions come up, feel free to plug those in the chat. And then finally, I did want to go over our goals and intentions for the day. So for each community convening, our goals are first and foremost to inspire community and fuel creative conversation. We're also really committed to showcasing how arts and culture can help further a variety of community priorities. It's not just about arts and culture alone. Arts and culture touches so many community priorities at once. We also aim to align with the collective priorities and strategic recommendations of the Project ABC Cultural Plan. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Project ABC Cultural Plan, it is Summit County's current cultural plan. We helped execute that in 2018, and there are some collective priorities and strategic recommendations embedded in that plan. And so these community convenings, thanks Jake, he just put it in the chat if you're interested in it, but these community convenings and these discussions really help with the implementation portion of this plan so that the community is constantly talking about some of these arts and culture topics that kind of bubbled to the surface during the planning process. We also aim to shine a light on current and relevant topics that are at the forefront of conversation locally, whether that's public art or rural arts development. Sustainable tourism is a big one, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and so on. And then finally, we love to celebrate and learn from people who are doing inspiring and innovative work in the arts and culture sector in other communities. And so we're so thrilled to have Mariam here. To give you guys, just for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Arts Council, we are an independent nonprofit organization in Park City and Summit County, and we oversee the entire county. Our mission is to serve our arts and culture community by driving creative programming, providing valuable resources, and cultivating connections But really, we envision a community where arts and culture is critical, where creatives can thrive, and where all people can connect through the arts. I did mention this a little bit before, but we launched in 2018, we launched Summit County's first ever cultural plan. And this was led and driven by community stakeholders in the arts, nonprofit leadership, local businesses, government, resorts. And so many of those collective priorities that surfaced, what they do is they create a roadmap for the future of arts and culture. And so these community convenings are one of the many ways that we implement that plan. And let's see, I think what I'm going to do is pass it on to Jake. He's going to give you a little bit more background, and I think then we'll get to Mariam. Oh, and then I'm going to talk about our public art programs, and then we're going to pitch it to Mariam. But go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, I'll be quick here. Just to build off of what Jocelyn mentioned about the Project ABC cultural plan, which I did put in the chat there if you want to check it out. We're going to have roughly 4 years since the completion and adoption of that plan, and we've been working through the Arts Council to oversee implementation of what that looks like. It's an interesting document, as many of you who are involved know, in that it's not owned by the Arts Council. There are many stakeholders and partners, artists, organizations, government groups that are really leading out the implementation of that plan, but the Arts Council oversees and monitors and supports that implementation process along the way. And for those of you who have been involved in that process for a while, you know that arts and culture has really elevated as a conversation throughout Summit County in the last 4 years. The Arts Council has grown into a much stronger organization over that time, as have many other organizations. And many of those recommendations and priorities in that document have come to fruition, and we're gaining great momentum and progress. One of the big pieces that comes out of that as a result of that process is an annual State of the Arts report that the Arts Council produces. And we are working on the data analysis on that right now, and that'll be coming out in the coming months. So keep an eye out for that. And then these community convenings are a huge way that we continue to have conversation. One of the things we heard was that, yes, the plan is great, but the conversations that happened during the planning process were really where a lot of the magic was happening. And so these community convenings are a way for us to continue those conversations where, right, we may not be planning in the traditional sense, but we want to continue to engage with you all and have thoughtful conversations about what arts and culture means. So we look to align these conversations with specific priorities in the document, in the plan, and then we find thought leaders really throughout the world who are doing interesting work tied to those priorities. We can learn from what are the ways in which other people are thinking about these priorities, and then how might we bring those concepts into Summit County. We found Mariam actually from research from the previous community convening, which was about art on trails, as we were thinking about the new work on the rail trail. And we had found her work as a previous curator with Forestry England, and I don't know if she'll talk about much of that work today, but that's how we kind of tracked her down. We reached out, and upon our first conversation, our minds were just expanded in terms of the possibilities of what public art can be, expanded in terms of the ways in which she might be able to not just talk about the ways in which in previous thought art connected to trails, but really the way that public art can connect to life in so much broader of a way, and the way that we really might just start reframing and reimagining what's possible with public art. So we brought her in originally in conversation for, I think, a much smaller conversation than what we're going to have today. I think today is going to be much more expansive than it could have been. So I'm very excited about the direction that this conversation should go today, and the things that we'll be able to think about and talk about coming out of this presentation from Mariam. So I'm going to pass back to Jocelyn to quickly talk about the public art boards, and then we will let you jump right in there.
So because the core of this conversation surrounds the idea of public art, what does public art mean in communities? What is art for art's sake, and what is art not for art's sake? And how do we apply that to our certain communities? I did want to make everybody aware of the public art opportunities that exist in our community. It is a little confusing, to be honest, even as someone who's very close to the work. I understand it can be hard to understand how to engage with our public art boards and processes. And so I'm just going to give a quick highlight. So there are actually 2 public art boards that exist in Summit County. There is one that oversees all public art that exists in Summit County outside of 84060 zip code. And then there is a Park City Public Art Board that oversees parks artwork and public artwork that only exists within 84060 zip code. For those of you who are from out of town joining with us, 84060 is kind of Park City proper, Old Town, and it's a fairly small area. And it's kind of the Old Town Park City, right? And then we do have an expansive general area that encompasses all of Summit County. And so these are both public commissions. They're appointed by local governments. So the city council and city government appoints all of the board members that participate on the public art board for the city. And then same with the county manager oversees that process. And it is a public process. So anyone who resides in those zip codes can be a part of the public art boards. They meet monthly and they are public meetings. So the Park City Public Art Board meets every second Monday from 5 to 7 at City Hall or via Zoom. These are public meetings. So even if you're an artist or you're a community member that's curious about what's happening within the public art realm, you can join in and check it out every second Monday at 5 p.m. And then the Summit County Public Art Board meets every Tuesday, first Tuesday of the month, from 4 to 6 p.m. And again, it's a really wonderful opportunity to get engaged, especially if you are an art enthusiast, an artist, interested in the expansion and the development of public art within our communities. So luckily, Jake put some links in the chat for us about each program individually. So I encourage you really to explore those if this is interesting to you, or maybe at the end of this conversation, hopefully you're super inspired to get involved. So yeah, that's public art in Summit County. Feel free to reach out with questions about that, but we hope you guys are inspired. And I think we're pretty much ready. Hopefully, Mariam, you've caught your breath from your crazy commute this morning. And we can pitch it over to you and get started. Again, I encourage everyone to put questions in the chat. We will address them when she's done. And we're looking forward to a really meaningful discussion after Mariam gets going. So thanks so much for being here, Mariam.
Thank you. Yeah, I've definitely caught my breath. So it's morning for you guys, but it's 4:30 for us over here. It's sort of dark behind me right now. But thank you so much for the invitation, Jocelyn and Jake. Jake, I've managed to get my presentation uploaded. So maybe you might need to share your screen. Give me access to share screen at some point. Let me try it. I'm not the most technically savvy person, so I'll probably end up sharing the wrong thing. But I thought I would sort of, before I start, talk about the projects that I've selected to show today and why I've selected those in particular. And I felt that they covered a really broad range of the ways in which artists are working in public spaces. And, you know, even when I speak to people, I've been doing this job and working in public art. I mean, my BA was in public art as an artist, and that's going back some 20 plus years now. But people immediately assume that I put sculpture in public spaces. And it's lovely because sculpture in public spaces has given people a language or a framework to think about what art outside a museum or gallery could look like. But I'm always keen to trigger a conversation about how much more it can be. And the fact that, yes, sculpture in public spaces has a long history. We've been putting ideas outside, I mean, since the Sumerians probably. So it's not like any one culture at any one particular time can claim, you know, what it means to put something in a context where everybody sees it. But there are so many interesting and innovative and exciting ways in which artists are occupying various different kinds of spaces with different kind of ideas. And I hope that my presentation today covers some of the ones around the world that I find really interesting, but then I've also brought in, so I've got 3 projects from around the world that I thought I'd show you, and then 3 projects that I've been working on that sort of touch on different things. And what I hope at the end of it will leave everybody with is an opportunity to talk about what's possible where they are and why certain things need to be, you know, could happen. One of the things that I always find is that, you know, to be imaginative in beyond the museum and gallery is always tough, because there are so many invested interests that exist, from, you know, the local authority to somebody who's worried about their next election to commercial interests. And, you know, that those negotiations that need to happen are really key to make sure that what we don't end up producing in public context is the sort of most reduced, safest work, but actually it should be the work that inspires us most to have a conversation. And sometimes that means addressing some tough stuff that's happening. You know, I'm not one that's up for beautifying somewhere for the sake of it. If something beautiful comes out of a scenario where we all collaborated, but we all recognize that we were working in tricky territory, then that's great. But just to beautify something as a plaster over a situation is not necessarily something that I personally am involved in. But I just thought these projects give an example of how out of some very tricky contexts, some really amazing ideas can emerge. So if I start, and there's a few films that I've got embedded in here that I will show little sort of 10-15 second clips of as well. I think we're going till 5:30 my time, so that's an hour from now. So if I try and sort of wrap it up within sort of 45 minutes at the most, and then that gives us plenty of time to talk about what I've shown. So if I go to,
You should have, oh, you got it. Look at that.
Yeah, does that work?
It's worked so far, and so I think if you
Yeah,
just...
can we see, let me see if I can now be really fancy. Oh no, wrong one. Let's see. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to show you presentation mode. I wanted to show you full screen mode. Oh well, never mind. You can see this image, right?
Yes.
I wanted to start with this project. I think Jocelyn and Jake will know exactly who this is, because this is an artist whose work I have followed for a long time. His name is Matthew Mazzotta, and I'm really excited that he's coming to the UK in a couple of weeks' time. We're going to be having
jealous.
Yeah, so I've invited him here because I would really love to talk with him about the possibility of what we could do with him in the future. The reason why I wanted to open with this project is because, you know, on face value, people will go past that and go, that's not an artwork, it's just a small pink house. And the reason that I've chosen that to show you is because this, he was invited. Matthew is somebody who is really interested in how methodology is a key part of how you make work. And the way that Matthew works is he will be invited to an area where he will try and get to know the residents as much as possible. And in this area, which was in Alabama, this is in York, Alabama, he was invited by the local town, and the Smithsonian, I think, were involved in some way. And he starts by setting up something really quite beautiful, which is an outdoor living room. So he will put out a carpet, he will put out some chairs, he'll make some tea and coffee, and he will invite the local residents to come and sit with him and to talk about, you know, their feelings about their town, their local place, what their aspirations are, what their despairs are. And he really, he plays this incredible, almost sort of listener role. And one of the things he said to me is, you know, in a lot of places that were once part of an industrial boom, but are then afterwards part of a sort of economic decline, what you find is that people's hopes and aspirations often intersect. So quite often they talk about how great the town once was, how it's not necessarily as great as it used to be, opportunities for their children and their loved ones are less, and how can you really work in that scenario to create something with the community that's going to go on to be generative and beneficial. And this is a brilliant example of a project like that. Now, let me see if I am able to show you the video. This project was called Open House. And when he was invited, let's see. Oh, did the video come up?
It did not.
Am I sharing a white screen at the moment? Can you see does it say Open House?
I can only see the red house. You're in kind of a presentation.
Oh, is it still my presentation? Is it not the video link?
It is not the video link.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
see.
Mariam, you might need to just stop screen share and then screen share your full window.
Yeah.
Or your full screen, so that way it switches.
This is where I'm just not technically savvy.
That's okay. This is meant to be a casual conversation. It's all good.
Okay, let's try. Can you see, is my cursor moving on a website that says Matthew Mazzotta?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to play you the first sort of minute of this video, because rather than me trying to paraphrase what this project is, I think he does it beautifully. Is that working? So I'll pause it there because I just wanted to show you essentially that this house was created from a very, very loved local landmark, which is this derelict pink house that I'm going to scroll down to now, and how the local community really talked about how they love this house because it's so beautiful, it's so pink, it's such a landmark, but its derelict state reminds them of a sort of political and economic decline that was happening in their own town, and how could they address that? So what Matthew did was create this very, very beautiful structure from stripping away what could be reused from this house into this new structure that was built. And at the beginning, did you see the way that it all opened out flat and then they closed it back up again? So when it opens out flat, it was used by the local community. Let's see if I can find it. So here are pictures of it opening out. And it's purposely built to be an open air theatre like this, so that the local community can then come together and then use this structure to put on their own performances. And in many ways, when people think of public art, they think of this static sculptural thing. And what I love about this project is that Matthew gives you a static sculptural object, but he also gives you an opportunity for the community to come together to program that object to be what it is that they need to be, so that it can continue to be generative, and it can continue to trigger new forms of creativity that could come out of that place. So I wanted to start with that because in many ways it's sort of the opposite of what people think of when they think of public art, both in terms of the methodology of how he came up with the idea, but also what he then leaves with the community afterwards. The second project is also a project by Matthew that I thought would be really, really brilliant for everyone to talk about as a sort of discussion point, because once again, this one was, oh God, it's completely gone from my head now. I think it might have been Nebraska. He'll say it in the video, but again, it's a town that has suffered fairly substantial economic decline. And Matthew always talks about how, you know, I don't want to come and put something in a town that they don't need. I'd rather come and modify something that's already there to fulfill a need that they have. And I'll very quickly show you the storefront theatre, which I think is an absolutely brilliant project. And Matthew has won awards for both these two projects that I am about to show you. So this is the second one.
My project is called the Storefront Theater, and it's in Lyons, Nebraska. Basically, it's a facade that bends down over Main Street. Bleachers come out, a screen pulls in. It turns Main Street into a movie theater. I'm an artist, but I build buildings. This project came about through an investigation with the people. They told me how downtown was a center of community life and how that has been destroyed over time by these economies of scale and globalization that have pulled all these businesses away. They said, how can we revive it? And so our project took that as the focus.
I'll stop that there. Those videos are both on YouTube, should anybody want to see those. From there, we'll go into a very, very different project. So, and the reason I wanted to show you something now completely different to what Matthew's doing is because there is really no one type of public art. And I really wanted to leave today's talk with this really open way of thinking about what's possible in terms of ideas in your community and and in the society in which you live, but also to really underline the fact that if something is coming from a grassroots up and from a drive and a determination being led by local people, then what will be created will be truly resonant to where you are. And there's no, you know, imposition from outside coming in to say, this is what art should look like here. These are all examples of what art, public art looks like in different contexts. The second project, it's so different that I'm going to be really intrigued as to what people think about it. And it's this. It's a project by a collective in Singapore called Vertical Submarine. And I was in Singapore at the beginning of 2020. And, you know, I don't know how many of you know about Singapore, but it's a very, very, what's the word? Policed, but also it's a very obedient society in which, you know, people follow the government rules and regulations and guidelines very closely. And one of the things that I find really interesting about a place like Singapore is its relationship to democracy and its relationship to protest, and how these things are very complicated in Singapore in terms of what is people's ability to gather in an assembly and to protest, and how they're able to raise their voice if they are unhappy with their government. And this project by Vertical Submarine, I actually think is kind of genius, in that when I asked them what this project was about, I'll go through some of the pictures. So I'll show you the pictures first, and then I'll come back and give you the explanation. To a lot of people, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, that's graffiti in a toilet. Right. And in some levels, yes, it is graffiti in a toilet. And this is what all the graffiti looks like. But this toilet is actually in one of the few art centers in Singapore, public art centers in Singapore, called the Substation. And the Substation is this much loved local contemporary art space. And it's a free space that you can enter. You don't need any kind of permission to go in. But the toilet of this place is also one of the few freely accessible public loos in a place like Singapore. So the fact that the artists had identified a public toilet in a public building as a site for an artwork that could be quite politically charged, I thought was absolutely genius. The thing that makes it really brilliant is the fact that all the graffiti all over is kind of a history of democracy from all over the world. So it's a history of, some of it talks about how democracy was born in Greece and why and what it was talking about. You can see some of the letters are, in some of it there were Mandarin letters, there was some kanji, some, you know, there was different texts from all over the world. So they hadn't made it just specific to a European notion of democracy, but they had also included historical texts around conversations and struggles for democracy in places like China, which I think is really interesting given the close proximity to somewhere like Hong Kong. They'd also included some of the texts, I think, from the Middle East as well. So it was a really interesting work where you could legitimately lock yourself in a room to read about democracy in a country that polices democracy in a very particular kind of way. And I just think it's absolutely brilliant. And, you know, I wanted to include it because in many ways, it's the antithesis of what people think of when they think of beautiful public art. But in terms of the marriage of sight and idea and the transformative experience that it could create for the person who experiences it, I thought it was a really brilliant example of what, you know, you don't need to spend a lot of money. You just need the right artist with the right idea in the right place for it to be absolutely brilliant. And I hope this project in particular, I hope the two of them together trigger some interesting conversation about, you know, what does it mean to occupy a space with an idea at a particular moment, and what that does for the audience who experiences it. The idea that you can lock yourself in legitimately in a toilet to read about democracy, I think is just brilliant. Before I came to Artangel, a long time ago now, nearly 10 years ago, I was working for the London Underground, and the London Underground is the official art program. Art on the Underground is the official art program for the London Underground. And I'm going to collapse that so you don't see me talking. And the reason I wanted to include this is because the London Underground is it's a city-wide network. And essentially there's 270 stations and they connect all of London through the tube network, the thing that is on strike today, which is why it's so difficult to get around the city. But this network was built in 1863 and it's the oldest tube network in the world. And it has within its sort of foundations a brilliant relationship to art and design. There was a managing director of the London Underground called Frank Pick, who was operating right at the beginning of when the London Underground was being created. And Frank Pick followed very much the William Morris line of thinking, which was have nothing in your house that isn't beautiful or functional. And as a result, the things that the London Underground is completely famous for, things like this symbol, things like the tube map, which looks a little bit like that's the Barbara Kruger version of it on the cover of the map, but inside this paper map that you pick up in the station. And this font, the Johnston font, these have all been going since like the 1930s. And so there is design history baked into the London Underground. The Charles Holden stations that were done for the Piccadilly line, these are all sort of symbolic of London Underground's commitment to excellent art and design. And Art on the Underground operates very much in the legacy of that commitment to art and design in London Underground. And one of the projects that I was incredibly fortunate to be managing in my time there was this tube map cover. And the tube map cover, I mean, my director at the time described it as small but monumental. And I think she was spot on for describing it like that. It's a small throwaway piece of paper print that you can pick up in any tube station. And it's essentially the London Underground map it's called the pocket tube map, and you can, pick it up and take it with you. But the cover of the pocket tube map has been designated as a site for art since, I can't remember when the first one happened now, but that's the first one by Emma Kay. And when I arrived at Art on the Underground, they had just done this one by Eva Rothschild, and Michael Landes is the first one that I worked on. And from there, I went on to work on quite a few of them going forward. They're reprinted every 6 months, because if there are any changes on the network where a station has been closed for refurbishment or has finally got its disabled access all sorted, then the inside of the map is reprinted, which means that every 6 months there was a reprint that was done, and we would invite an artist for the cover and ask them to create us an artwork for the cover of it. I think one of my favorites is probably this one by an artist called Liam Gillick. It says Friday, January the 9th, 1863, and the title of the work is, you know what they'll call it? They'll call it The Tube. Friday, January the 9th, 1863 is the last day that London existed without a tube, because on January 10th, 1863 is when they opened the tube. So he was marking the last day that London was a version of itself before something else came into being. And I think it's probably one of my favorites. Another one of my favorites is probably this one by Jeremy Deller. This is a portrait of the longest serving tube member of staff on the cover. Another one that's a really beautiful one is Pay White's. It's a fragment of a carpet. She'd been to the V&A, which is not far from one of the tube stations in South Ken, and seen that they had this beautiful carpet there. And she wanted to sort of make reference to the fact that the tube, she talks about a magic carpet, but she also talks about the various museums and galleries that the tube network also services. One of the biggest, most humbling experiences for me was to work on the tube when it was celebrating its 150th anniversary. And there were lots of conversations around who we would be inviting to mark the 150th anniversary of the tube. And this is the tube map cover that was produced that year. And this cover is by an artist whose work I'd followed for a long time. He lives in Pakistan, and his name is Imran Qureshi. And we invited him to do a cover. This cover is called All Time Would Be Perpetual Spring. And it was really important for me that in this moment when we're marking 150 years of the tube, that we were also taking the opportunity to mark the contribution of migrant communities that had helped build this city. And inviting Imran to be the artist on the cover of that, it was a very subtle but prominent way of marking the contribution of migrant labour to building this city. I was at the London Underground at the office one day, and the phone rang, and it was a really elderly Pakistani gentleman. And he called up to say, I've just gone past a poster on the tube and it says Imran Qureshi on it, because we also used to put posters that the new tube map was out. And I said, yes, no, I knew all about it. And he said, where can I buy a poster? And I said, I'm happy to post you one for free, no problem. And he said to me, did you know that he was a Pakistani artist? And I said, yes, I did, And he said, I'm a Pakistani first generation migrant. I've lived in this city for 50 years. And it's the first time that I felt that this city was my home when I saw that. And I was so touched that I asked if I could write that quote down and send it to the managing director of London Underground, because I think that's a real example of how you put these things out there. You don't know who the audience of it might be. You don't know how it might touch people. You have a rough idea that, on the tube, it's going to be commuters, but you don't really know how it's going to resonate with people and how it's going to intersect with their own personal experience of life. And to have this person call up to tell me that, I was really incredibly touched by it. And it's one of the things that on the days when negotiating with all the people who own public space becomes tricky, and it does weigh you down. I remind myself that actually once the project's out there, it's going to touch so many people in ways that I don't know. So it's the kind of thing that keeps me, it energizes me, put it that way. The next project that I wanted to talk about was a project that I did in 2017. And again, sticking to this theme of, putting artworks and art sculptures, but in public spaces. The Tube is a really good example of a public space that is partly indoor, but is still a public space. Matthews is a really great example of a work that sits literally outside. And I think that is another layer in when we talk about public art is, do we mean outside space? Do we mean public spaces like museums, galleries, tube stations, public loos in a public building, you know? So I think that's another layer in all of this that becomes really interesting when one is thinking about what constitutes public art and what do we really mean by that word public. So I was invited by an organization called Film and Video Umbrella who wanted to do a project to mark the 70th anniversary of Indian independence. And Britain's long historic relationship with South Asia, you know, is a contentious one in that there was the empire, South Asia was carved up and taken over really for a few hundred years, and then when empire came to an end through various different very violent struggles, resulted in partition, in which a massive part of South Asia then was divided up into new nations that were formed as a result. And to mark that as somebody of British Pakistani heritage myself, it was a really tricky thing for me to consider. How am I going to do this? You know, because it's not celebratory for me. I grew up in Pakistan in a house where my aunt was a widow because her husband had been killed in the war between India in the 70s. So the idea that marking something that happened 70 years ago was history was not a way in which I could think about. I didn't have the luxury of thinking about that event in that way. But I still felt that there were public sites in this country that could be springboards for thinking about Britain's relationship with South Asia, something that I personally never experienced in school. So we went around thinking about where exactly we would want to do something and what does that look like. And we had a number of organizations that came on board that wanted to work with us. The National Trust was one of them. Canal and River Trust was another one. These are big nationwide organizations that look after buildings, canal networks, rivers, you know, some really interesting public contexts in this country. And these are just some examples of the types of buildings by working with these big institutions that came on board. So on the left, you're seeing Quarry Bank Mill. It's one of the large textile mills in Cheshire, and the relationship between Britain, South Asia and textiles is a long and historic one. And it's also what actually connects Britain and South Asia to America as well, because a lot of the cotton was brought over from America during the transatlantic slave trade. The produce that was created as a result of that were commodities like cotton. So cotton came from the Americas. It would be brought to places like this one in Quarry Bank Mill, where it would have been spun and then it would have been sent out to South Asia as a commodity to sell. So these buildings sit in our landscape, but yet they are deeply tied to our international histories. Again, this is three mills house or something, the house mill, and or it's also called 3 mills, and it's where they used to store grain that was used to then fuel the navy as it went out around the world in the 17 and 1800s. And then this is the roundhouse in Birmingham, where the roundhouse would be full, this area would be full of coal, for example, and then that coal would be taken down under this ramp here, loaded onto a canal boat that would be parked just under here on the canal network, and then shipped around the country to transport goods. All of these buildings are now public buildings, in that they were once upon a time major nodes within industry, but are now owned by big public organizations like the National Trust, like the local council, for example. And I know that you will have in your portfolio of buildings where you are assets that are owned by the council that sort of sit somewhere between a private space and a public building. And I thought, in contrast to Matthews and in contrast to the Tube, this was another good way of thinking about, well, actually, what do we mean by public when we talk about public art? So the thing that I wanted to do was to explore through film how these buildings actually are not just local, but they're also national and international. And what are those national and international stories that connect these buildings to South Asia? I spoke to 6 artists that were living, working in, or were connected to South Asia in some way, shared with them the buildings that I had that were willing to be part of this nationwide exhibition, and said, this is a work of yours that I think is really interesting. But then the artist came back saying, actually, we think this work that we've got is also really resonant with what you're doing. And then slowly over the course of about 18 months, I created a number of different possibilities of stagings in all these different venues. And to just give you an example of how different they were, this is the House Mill, a work by Barney Abidi showing, but then this is that factory that I showed you in Cheshire. And the main work here is a work by Desire Machine Collective. But what this coming to this venue with this type of exhibition also did was give the venue an opportunity to bring out of its archive objects that it hadn't had a chance to show yet. So they then created all this display that went around it because I had given them a context in which to bring out some of the work. Again, this is a public building. You can access it from, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. It's massively in the leisure economy, although it was once a factory. This is that roundhouse that I showed you in Birmingham. And then one of my favorites, which was the National Waterways Museum, which had a boat. And they said to me, what would I like to show on the boat on the canal? So this is the screening that we set up inside the boat. And then finally, we had invited an artist called Imran Chana to come on residency and make a brand new work. And Imran went to 4 out of the 7 locations where we did the show. And he collected dust from all of those, and he put them in these beautiful jars. And then we created a stand, and he did a drawing of a time when Britain, there was a venue called the Crystal Palace that was built around about the industrial, the moment when Britain's industry was really booming, and Crystal Palace burnt to the ground. So he did this beautiful drawing of Crystal Palace that he kept erasing and drawing again and erasing again. And then all you're left with on this huge piece of paper is an imprint of Crystal Palace. So I wanted to show this exhibition in particular because it's such a variety of different kinds of work. But again, it also gets us thinking about public space. It gets us thinking about what constitutes a public when we're talking about a big national moment, like partition in India and its relationship to Britain. There's so many layers in this that I felt it was a good project to throw into the mix, to have a discussion about afterwards as to whether or not the group feels, in their opinion, this is public art, and whether showing it in this way and talking about it in this way broadens people's perception of what we mean by when we say art in the public domain. This was one of my favorite stagings in that project. It's an audio work that we showed in Cliff Castle in Bradford. Again, a public space in that it's owned by the local council, so it's taxpayers' money that pays for it. And the work that you're going to hear is a piece made by a collective in India called Desire Machine Collective. They live near an ancient forest. So again, we're now back to the idea of the rural space. And in the ancient forest that they live near, it's called a sacred forest. You can't even take a single leaf without it being classed as theft by the elders that look after it. So they had to negotiate with the elders whether they were able to record audio in the forest or whether that would be considered theft. And in the end, the elders gave them permission to record audio of the forest. Tucked away in this room, hidden from people, were speakers and sensors. And the more they walked around, the more it set off the audio. So I'll play you a little bit. Jocelyn, give me a thumbs up and let me know if you can hear it.
Mariam, there's a little bit of feedback.
So what you're hearing there really is the noise of a forest. So it might be a bit hissy.
Maybe that's what it is then.
Yeah, it's the actual forest that you're hearing. So, but what was really great was people looked completely, because you normally imagine these kinds of rooms to just be so quiet. And all of a sudden people were walking in and they were hearing the sound of a forest and they were kind of freaked out by it. But I won't play it again because it's probably not translating so well. The next project I wanted to share with you is during lockdown, I was invited by this stately, it's a sort of historic site in England and it's called Civic House and Gardens. This is the whole gardens and the house sort of sits around here. And what's really fascinating about Chiswick House is, again, we are back into public-private territory where all throughout the pandemic, this park remained open to the public because they They see themselves, well, they are a community, they're a park that was gifted to the local community. It's in the care of the local council, but also Chiswick House and Garden Trust. But what's interesting about this site is that this building is managed by English Heritage. So it's a three split organizations that are custodians of this site. And it makes it a really interesting site because it really throws up, well, who really owns it? Is it owned by the people? Is it owned by English Heritage? Is it owned by the local council? You know, and that's where it sort of sits in this very slippery territory. But what's interesting about this site is this house was built by a man called Lord Burlington in the 1700s. And he was a big art collector. He was known as the Apollo of the arts because of his patronage of the arts. And he built this house really to house his art collection. And in the 1700s, he'd been on what at the time a lot of very wealthy people were doing. It's called the Grand Tour, where you went around Italy and France and you saw these, you know, beautiful buildings, villas in these countries. And if you had the means, you came back to England and you built yourself one of them. And it was a way of showing to everybody how wealthy you were. But at the time, he also worked with a man called William Kent. And William Kent not only designed the house, which is called a Palladian house, but he also designed essentially the English country garden. Now, most people think of the English country garden and they look at these beautiful manicured gardens or a particular kind of garden and they think it looks really natural. But William Kent actually was the architect of what creating an English landscape would look like. He is the man who sat down and said, okay, this is what my version of Englishness is. And it's really brilliant to go to one of the first sites in which he had essentially experimented with creating the English landscape. When I was invited, one of the things that I found really interesting about this public site that was also private because it was locked most of the time of the year, but yet you could access the grounds and the park. It was all sorts of interesting kind of points of access and things like that. But what I found really fascinating was how much people think of this as a kind of very English place. And actually the house is a complete rip-off of like Italian architecture, and the gardens are completely manufactured to give you a sense of Englishness. And that also got me thinking about the borough in which this house is, which is in Hounslow. One end of Hounslow is incredibly white and incredibly English. The other end of Hounslow is incredibly diverse in that there are huge amounts of ethnic minority and migrant communities there. And to get to this end of the borough from the other end of the borough is actually really, really tough because you need to take something like 3 buses to get there. And I was like, wow, this is just one, you know, it's something crazy like 3 miles between them, but yet coming from one end to the other is virtually impossible for some of those communities. And I was really interested in, okay, how do we open up this site so that other communities who have historically not seen themselves in this version of Englishness see themselves in this version of Englishness? Because it's really important for me, a bit like what I did with the Changing Places exhibition and using very English sites and very local sites to demonstrate an internationalism. How could I do that here? So, and the other thing I wanted to do was, this is another fascinating thing that I'm sure you guys have as well, in that this site has been preserved by English Heritage to be a particular version of itself, which is the 1700s version. Whereas in the 1800s, this was a mental asylum. It was called Chiswick House Mental Asylum. In the 1900s, it was an auxiliary fire station during the Second World War. In the 20th century, it was nearly torn down because nobody had the money to keep it up. It's only in the 21st century that we have preserved it to look like its 17th century version, and the inside looks like that. Why pick that version over any of the other versions? And I found that really curious. And the fact is that when people come, they want that slice of 1700s England. It's a really interesting, nostalgic relationship that people want from a site like this. And I found that really fascinating because I was like, but England isn't that 1700s England. It's so many other Englands with it. How can I bring those other Englands into it while sitting comfortably with what this site is? But also, how can I recognize the fact that this site is local, it's national, it's also international because of the context of, you know, the architecture is Italian. In these grounds, you've got flowers from, you know, from camellias from China all the way through to, you know, trees from Lebanon and stuff like that. I was like, it's an international site. Like the idea that we've claimed it to be an English site is kind of absurd. But also it's not just connected to international. There's so many other ways that we can think of how we connect to the world that we live in or the environment that we live in. So I very specifically invited artists who were going to be able to trigger that kind of conversation. But I didn't want it to just be an exhibition and a program of events and activities that surrounded the exhibition. I wanted to conceive of the whole thing as a program that turned all of this site into a new kind of community asset, one that the whole borough felt there was something for them there. So the first bit of work that we did was I invited a sound artist called Peter Ajay. He is British. He has grown up in the Middle East. He is of Ghanaian heritage, and he does a lot of work with his brother David Ajay, the architect, and they do a lot of work around music for architecture. David Ajay is famous for the buildings that he's made all over the world. In fact, he's just done the pavilion at the Serpentine with the Astor Gates, and Peter does a lot of audio work for that. And when I was speaking with Peter, we went around the house and we talked about how sound was a really brilliant way to occupy this house. Look at how cluttered this house is. Trying to put any kind of object in there, it would have just got lost amongst what's in there. But secondly, good luck trying to put anything in there past English heritage. They are so particular about what's allowed in. So we were like, okay, let's make a sound work. Then we talked about who we wanted to make the sound work with. And Peter had said he had always wanted to bring together South Asian music instruments and musicians and West African musicians and instruments. So we contacted a number of different musicians living in London. This is us actually recording in lockdown. We had to do it one at a time. So, you know, day 1, day 2, day 3, because we couldn't be very near each other while we were doing it. But I've also got a video here just to play you a little bit about what the recording session looked like in the house. And then essentially what Peter did was he took the audio files, he created a sort of framework structure that they were all listening to as they were recording, but they were all invited to improvise over it. Peter took all that material away and he created a 6-channel work. So in each of the rooms, that's the green velvet room, that's the red velvet room. When he made the 6 works, in each room, there was a different and unique sound playing, a soundtrack playing for each room. What's I'll come back to what the most controversial, I'll do a hands up poll about what's the most controversial work that people thought. The second work was with an artist called Jaimini Patel. And Jaimini makes a lot of stuff with natural materials. And Jaimini came and spent 3 months with the gardeners in those huge gardens that I'd shown you, and was collecting from all the green matter that they were pruning, leaves that she would then wash, dry, freeze, and then over the course of about 3 months created this absolutely beautiful floor work out of it. Again, talking about public, private, what was really fascinating here was that the public come through this building all the time. They have bits of leaf, bits of mud, bits of whatever on their shoes. But for us to make a work out of the very green matter that's sitting outside and to bring it into the house, the loops that we had to jump through to make English heritage okay, what we were doing were extraordinary. But again, it threw up this conversation around outside is in a permanent state of death and decay and rebirth all the time, but yet the work, the lengths that they have to go through to preserve all of this was so extraordinary. And we found that a really fascinating conversation with English heritage. She made a second work. So this was made from January to March. And then she made a second work from June through to March, April, May, which then came out in June. And you can see this is the color of the gardens in the winter months going into spring. And then this was the color of the leaves from spring going into summer. Both these works are entirely natural material. So at some point they will start to disintegrate and there will be no more. The third work, which in many ways will be people's idea of public art, is in the gardens. And this is a work, it's called an analematic sundial. It's by an artist called Mark Wallinger. And essentially this piece of stone here has the months of the year carved into it. And these balls here, these spheres, go from 6 in the morning to 9 p.m. at night. And then when you, depending on where you stand, so let's say you stand where it says April, in April, when the sun hits you and you cast a shadow, it points at what time of day it is. So it was basically an outdoor human sundial. On the hour, every hour, a bubble machine would go off with a tune to let people know that it was the hour. And honestly, the amount of kids that came running to this bubble machine, it was a real moment of joy during a very tricky 2021 where people are just coming out of lockdown. In tandem with these artworks, I also programmed a series of events and activities. This is Lauren. She is both an architect and a yoga instructor. We invited her because while Chiswick House was all about geometry and architecture, yoga is all about internal geometries and how one understands those. And Lauren is brilliant at being able to combine both those things. So we held some outdoor yoga activity. We also held a sashiko stitching workshop because we wanted to use this as an opportunity to slow down time, to get people to sit and actually spend time there rather than just coming to the gardens, whizzing through with their dog and leaving. It was about come, sit down, spend a couple of hours, learn this beautiful Chinese craft of sashiko stitching and just spend time here. Let's turn this place into something else other than just what it's used for at the moment. Another workshop that we hosted was a photography workshop. This is Jaspreet Singh, going back to what I was saying about the borough having one end full of migrant communities and the other a very affluent, much whiter demographic. Jaspreet lives at the other end of the borough, and I was really keen to invite artists that are living at the other side who are from those migrant diaspora communities to come and feel like workshops were also there for them and that they were going to be running and leading them. And then finally, we did a workshop with an artist called Ansuman Biswas in collaboration with an astrophysicist called Shamkor Kag. And they did a work around sound and silence and how one sits and really connects with their surrounding environments. I mean, I think she's having a great time over here. And in many ways, programming all these different activities was a way of showing that this site that people go, oh no, this is just a historical English site. It's a garden and a house, and we go there and we give our money and we learn about the past, or we walk our dog, or we go for a walk in the gardens. I wanted to take this opportunity to say, no, actually, this public site can be so much more than that, and we will animate it through programming and activity. What I think was really brilliant was that Peter took the opportunity to talk about how this site can generate a conversation about how we relate to each other's histories through sound by bringing in South Asian and West African musicians in what is historically an extremely English site. He triggered a conversation around whose history gets represented and how. Jaimini got us thinking about permanence and nature and outside, and how our relationship with the natural world and the natural world's relationship with us is in a symbiotic relationship where we are pruning plants and they are adapting to our pruning and learning, and we are then learning about them by doing that, and how we are in this constant state of learning with the plants and the environment around us. And Mark's project connects us to the sun and this light that travels thousands of miles down to hit us, to cast a shadow, which we can then use to tell the time. And I think coming back to my previous project, which is about local sites connected to national and international stories, this again was a local site that we connected to a national and international story, but we also connected it to a universal possibility of the shadow cast by the sun. And it, again, I wanted to sort of, that's the last project that I wanted to share with you all, but I thought collectively now, what all of these projects should show is my approach to public space isn't just about occupying a courtyard in a town square with a sculpture, but it's about thinking through how the ideas of artists give us the opportunity to really think about the spaces that we inhabit and the places that we live and what their potential is. And, you know, for you, the potential will be very different compared to the stories, the narratives, you know, but it's the idea of the artist that can help put some of these things in our way for us to talk about and just sit with and live with and create space for different forms of acknowledgement, dialogue, discussion, ownership, and new ways of being to come about. To just end very quickly, the most controversial work and I didn't think any of the works were controversial, but the work that people complained about most was Peter's, because they said, why are you playing South Asian instruments in this house? You should be playing Handel. And I thought, well, my job here is done, because actually the sheer fact that you think there is only one kind of way in which we should be talking about history and ourselves, I hope this project left people with food for thought as to why I had put that there. And on that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Those were, I mean, just the sheer variety of everything that you shared. And there were some new pieces that we hadn't discussed before. I know we had chatted a lot and talked about some works that you've been involved with, and it was so fun to see, you know, glimpses into other projects that you've worked on. So thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. When I was looking through my notes, I was like, actually, there's a few more that I think would broaden the conversation for people to think about what is potentially possible in where the space that they're living in.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, we do have robust public art programs here in Park City and Summit County, but you know, I think the way that people apply for, or the public art, or the way that even we present it, it can be maybe a more traditional application, I think, in contrast to maybe something that you just showed. And that's not across the board. I mean, we've done a lot of different projects, that even some temporary projects that might break the mold a little bit. But I think this is where, and I've been following Matthew Mazada's work for so long, so that was a fun connection to make with you. But that's where I think our public art boards and our programs here have a lot of potential, you know, to really think beyond, you know, let's just put a sculpture in this place. We have a current RFP out right now for some artwork out in the Ledges Event Center, which is out in Colville. And we're challenging artists to explore history and heritage of that sense of place and transform that into a work. And I'm curious to see the results, right? I mean, we may end up getting proposals that reflect a traditional sculpture, which is maybe what people will want in that area, or maybe we'll see something a little bit more, I don't know, outside of that type of art. So I'm excited at the prospect to see, you know, how this conversation can help us broaden some ideas. And even the way that, you know, when we write RFPs, or when we write these calls for proposals to put public art in our communities, you know, are we presenting these opportunities with limitations, so that, you know, we only do get a couple of bronze sculptures, you know, on our main streets, or are there ways that we can broaden that idea of public art to really challenge artists to bring brilliant ideas to our community, and something that can be thoughtful, meaningful, and goes beyond that basic view. So that's what I got out of it personally.
I find it was really helpful. I mean, when I was invited to Chiswick House, Xanthi, who was the director there, she wanted something imaginative. She didn't want something that she could conceive of. She was like, give me something that challenges me, that forces me to rethink what's possible here. And I think one of the things I would say about that site in particular, when you're working in that, and you'll know this, Jocelyn, from your work, that quite often you're dealing with so many different stakeholders in a place, and, you know, sometimes people just want to know what it is, and when you're saying to them, we don't know what it is yet, just come on the journey with us, we promise it'll be great, but we don't know what it is yet, that can be challenging. And I think sometimes things end up being a bit more conventional because they're easy to articulate at the beginning, and then I think people sort of get bound by that. But if there is a way in which your community can be the champions and the ambassadors and the advocates for imagination, then that it sort of reassures the powers that be that they're not about to lose their jobs over something too imaginative, because actually there is a demand and an appetite for it from the very people who could complain. So I think I get it. It's tough trying to do it because there's so many different players involved.
Well, and you're exactly right, because especially, so many of our public art projects are funded by public dollars. And, for like the Park City Public Art Board has money allocated directly from City Council, from general fund. And so, how we're spending public dollars and that uncomfortable, what you just described, right? When people are like, well, what is it? And you're like, well, let's be open to ideas. And that can be, not having that concrete idea can be scary and challenging. But anyways, I love everything that you've been talking about. And so I invite, I think Fanny's following the right direction here. I invite anyone who's interested in asking Mariam questions or just interested in starting discussion to please, raise your hand, put something in the chat. Fanny, you put on your video. Did you have something you wanted to chat about?
Yes, thank you. I just have a comment. Great presentation, because I represent a small nonprofit that focuses on the Mexican cultural awareness and the cultural connections with the rest of Latin America, and how. But because I recognize that the name of my organization is Mexico, but I utilize that as a platform to create cultural connections. And that's something that I absolutely see in your presentation. I guess my question to you is something that we have gone through, and especially for being from a very conservative state, when you picture Europe and England, it's immediately the mental model that comes to people is that as they come to England or any of those European museums, they are not picturing art exhibits that represent the immigrant communities, right? Everybody wants to see the beauty of what we interpret as art, because the Western cultures has taught us what is art. So I am so pleased to see that your presentation is focused on the diversity of the changes in demographics and how history has played a role in understanding art through the struggles of our history. I'm very pleased to see that. But I guess my question is, what has been the greatest challenge on basically creating art that is provoking in an environment where we are still so used to understanding art as something that belongs to a certain group of people?
That's such a big question. We could, I agree with you. I think we have for a long time had art history dominated by a particular kind of narrative and a perception of what art is and who is an artist, but also a perception around what does a country's demographic look like. But I think that is changing a lot. I don't know if you have the opportunity to go, but if you get a chance to go to somewhere like Venice Biennial, this one's just closed just now, so the next one will be in 2 years' time. The national pavilions at Venice are always a really interesting entry point into what a country is thinking about at that point. So you have an artist that's representing the country in America, Germany, France, Belgium. They all have their own national pavilions, and then some of the countries are grouped together in bigger buildings where they have smaller pavilions. But these are the countries, the ones that I've just mentioned, that have historically had like a building by itself that it occupies. And at this year's Venice, you had a Black woman represent America. You had a Black woman represent Britain. You had a Black woman represent Scotland. You had an Algerian French woman represent France. So, I would say that it is changing. It's not without its challenges. And of course, there are some people for whom they still have more conventional ideas of what art is. But I would say there's enough of a momentum and an appetite at the moment for people to want to see more represented. We know our communities are diverse. We know that our demographics are a mixture of historic and contemporary migration. And I just don't think we have any excuses now to not include that. So I would say that the challenge is to keep going.
Well, and Mariam, what I love what you said is, I think our sector specifically, the arts sector, is we have such a privilege that, you know, we are kind of within this work to push boundaries. And you know, the examples you just shared, you know, I think the art community is kind of at the forefront of that change in many ways through some of that. And so I think that's where, when we talk about how arts and culture can be used as a tool to further community priorities and be a catalyst for change, you know, some of these public art projects could it helps spark those dialogues to help make those connections. And you know, it's an area where I'm constantly pushing myself in the arena of our work to make sure that we're addressing those meaningful topics that, you know, and we work closely with Fanny and Artists in Mexico because that's so important, and because we're trying to break down those barriers. And so I'm hopeful that that's also something that people walk away with. Is I even see there's people on our call right now that have current seats on public art boards within the county and the city. So I'm hopeful that people will walk away knowing that having that power, I mean, it's a really powerful seat to have at city and county government, even as a volunteer, and there's opportunities to create change within that volunteer opportunity. So,
and I would argue that with that power, there is an enormous responsibility to be very thoughtful about the decisions that are being made of who and what is occupying our public spaces, and what that does for inclusivity, and what that does for exclusivity as well, you know. And I think we've had so many debates in this country following Black Lives Matter about the statues that we have in public spaces. You know, a statue was torn down in Bristol and thrown into the water because it was a slave owner called Colston. We live with these sort of lionized, fossilized statues that hold up and elevate a certain type of history. And we may have even forgotten who these people were, but some people won't have forgotten who they are, right? And to have our public spaces occupied by reminders that remind some communities and people of their oppression, while those who were privileged enough to benefit from it can be privileged enough to now almost see it as wallpaper. I think these are issues that we should talk about, you know, and how do you go about talking about that? And I know that America has had challenges with its own statues in public spaces as well. So, you know, we have an enormous responsibility about what we're putting in public spaces and how that makes people feel, and whether they are there to create pluralistic, inclusive societies, or whether they're there to create divisive and exclusive societies. And it's something that I take really, really seriously, and I read a lot around it to make sure that when those decisions are being made, they are as considered as possible.
Does anyone else on the call? You're welcome to put things in the chat as we go. Here we go. We have a question from Eva. How long did the Chiswick House project run?
So it's 6 months in total, but we worked on it for a year in the run up to it. So in total, I was sort of 18 months in my engagement with them.
That sparked another question that I had during your presentation for the video work that you did in those national landmarks, and it was all over England, right? So what did your engagement strategy look like? You know, were you, when you talked to or promoted to I guess all of England that this was happening, did people visit multiple sites, and was there kind of like a trail map that you could follow, and you were encouraged to like go on this massive excursion to see them all, and how long were they going? I'm so curious about how you structured that so that there was accessibility and people could really see maybe the full volume of what it was, or maybe it was just, you know, if you were living near one site, go see that, and that, you know, that did it. I'm just curious how you structured that.
That's a really brilliant question, because it is one of the conversations that we had a lot to make sure that we got that right. And we engaged a designer who helped us a lot in the thinking through of that. And in the end, what we decided was we would produce one generic pamphlet that accompanied the exhibition that had all the works, all the venues, and the overarching story in it. The other thing to say about that exhibition was that while I had 6 artists and 12 works, I didn't show all 12 works in a conventional touring way in all the venues. I then paired the right work with the right venue. Only one of the venue actually showed all 6 artists' work together. In some of them, it was a solo staging. For example, the audio work that you heard, that building only had 2 works in it, because not all the works made sense in all the buildings. So it was really particularly challenging to think through, okay, which work where and why. But then in order to give the breadth of what had been done, we produced one piece of print that was generic, that covered absolutely everything and gave the overarching narrative. But then within each one, you had a pullout that was relevant to the site that you were standing in. So you had this overall story in this leaflet, and then a yellow pullout that came out that said, in this venue today, let's say House Mill, in House Mill, you are looking at. And then it gave a bit more about the works that were in that building. Working with big partners like the National Trust and Canal and Rivers Trust means that you can tap into their audiences as well, because they have their own audiences that come to them, whether they're local or national. National Trust has hundreds of properties all over the country. So if they're to put out a message on social media to say, we've got an exhibition happening in this venue, you're likely to gather, not only attract local audiences to those venues, but you're also likely to attract a National Trust audience that might travel as well. Yeah. So that was one of the things that we knew from the beginning, that having a big partner like that would help us reach more people. Similarly, Canal and River Trust, same thing. So when we had all of these as partners for this one show, we knew that our reach was quite big. There were people that went to all of them, and I was actually really surprised. Yeah, I was really quite surprised. And I had an email from somebody who was doing their degree in arts management and museum studies at the time, a young British Asian girl. And she not only went to all of the shows, but she also FaceTimed her grandmother, who was very elderly, from the shows, to basically talk about how their history was being acknowledged in these very public British locations, you know. And I was really touched. She sent me an email and asked me if I would meet with her. She wanted to interview me as part of some of the research that she was doing for her degree. And I, again, going back to, you never know who this is going to resonate with and how, but equally I also had British English, well, not British Asian, but English white women, guys of a certain age, come to me and say, my father served in India during this period. To see this work here has really reminded me of my dad and the stories he would tell me. So I think it touched different people in different ways, in ways I wasn't expecting. And I think the thing that it also did was, going back to the audience point, you know, one of the venues said that I found it quite astonishing. They said that they hadn't had the chance to show some of the work they had in their archive to do with South Asia because the opportunity hadn't been there. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting perspective. The fact that it's part of your history should be the opportunity, but you need me to almost create another opportunity for you to bring out stuff that is actually part of your own story, because a lot of the story has been told in a very particular kind of way. So the history of the mill might have covered children working there, women's rights, the development of the town, but they hadn't felt empowered enough to be able to tell the South Asian connection of this building. And my exhibition gave them the opportunity to do that. Whereas I would argue the fact that you have a South Asian connection is as much your history as all the other stories that you feel comfortable telling. But if me doing my show then creates a further layer of possibility for you to show these artifacts, then great.
Yeah. We still have a little bit of time, and we did have someone put in the chat a really thoughtful and great conversation starter here. And Jorge, feel free to unmic if you want to expand on this and or join us on screen. And so Jorge mentioned that he loved the presentation, loved the idea of using locations as a way, hi Jorge,
Hi.
to reinterpret art. Is there a venue that can open up the opportunity for artists that aren't necessarily established, that is, despite the changing minds in the art world, there is still an aura of exclusivity and separation for people from more rural areas and the marginalized? What can be done to create more opportunities for those without ease of access to existing venues? That's a big question.
But it's a really important question.
Yes.
You know, so one of the, I think artist development programs are really important. I don't know what the city does in terms of supporting artist development programs right now, but when I was at Up Projects, one of the programs that I used to oversee, I didn't run it. It was run by a brilliant education and public program curator there, but it was called Constellations, and it was an artist development program. And you didn't necessarily need to have gone to art school to be part of Constellations, but what it did was put you in contact with, through a very structured way, artists who were much more advanced and experienced in their practice. And it created sort of monthly sessions for you to be able to come to talk about very focused issues in order for you as an artist to develop your practice. And I would say having programs like that supported at city level or at town level are really crucial, because they are not just relying on the art school to produce the artists, but they're recognizing that creativity happens in lots of different ways. And sometimes people need networks and mentoring in order to develop their practice further. I got a really brilliant email only yesterday, actually, from an organization called Artist Mundi in Wales, who was saying to me that instead of being at the next Venice Biennial in a pavilion, if I've understood their email right, instead of having one artist do one pavilion, they've actually given bursaries to 10 artists to develop their practice instead. And I think that's a really, it's actually a really enlightened way of thinking about actually what do we want to support going forward, and how do we want to do this? So I would say having network programs or professional development programs for artists is really crucial. I think the other thing is how do curators and people who are essentially decision makers in institutions exposed to the work of people outside of what they're looking at? And again, what role does the city play in that, and how does it support that breadth of work being shown? These are all things that do need to be considered if there is a genuine desire to want to support local practitioners developing their work more, but also having that opportunity to be seen more. I'm always against the idea of here's a local artist show and here's some community work show. I think it needs to be done in a really sensitive way. But I also recognize that, you know, artists who have been practicing for a while have a kind of skill and experience in being able to work with a commission in a way that an artist who hasn't had that same level of experience might be able to. It's always more tempting to go, oh, this artist has the experience, and then therefore they get the commission, and you support those who are already doing well. So what can be done to support those who are not getting that to reach those stages as well? And I think just giving an artist who's not as experienced a big commission isn't the answer, because that's not fair on them either. So what are those pathways for development that can be supported at local level and at city level? And that's whether that's a network of all the art schools coming together to offer free programs for people that can't afford to go to art school, whether that is a network mentoring group that's created by the city, funded by the city, of established artists being a mentoring network for more emerging artists. I mean, I don't know in your context what would be right for you, but there will be interesting and imaginative ways in which those who are outside of the conversation are supported to come into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Jocelyn, can I sneak in one more quick question?
Yeah.
So Mariam, one thing I noticed in your presentation today that I hadn't maybe noticed in previous conversations about this presentation was that there's kind of a tone of contention in a lot of the work, or a conflict, right? And I'm curious if that's just an inherent quality of doing work in public spaces. It's something that I'm realizing now, reflecting through projects that I've curated or been on commissions for in public art, that every one of them, no matter how safe we might have thought it was, has a tone of that, right? There's a moment of contention. There's a question about representation. There's a question of the history of the site or whatever that may be, right? But I'm curious how you think about that in your work, and if you do see that as just an inherent quality of putting work in public spaces, or yeah, just how you might think about that as a kind of ingredient in public art.
Such a big question. I don't even know where to enter into it. I think, how do I think about this? I don't think anywhere is completely fair for everyone. I just don't. You know, I think for every person whose version of the story gets told, someone else's version of the story doesn't, right? We're not at a point of like utopian consensus, right? We're just not.
Yeah.
And dominant narratives can overshadow minority narratives. Those who are vulnerable or oppressed get the least space to speak. When they do, quite often the narrative about how they speak gets dubbed in a certain kind of way. If I'm being particularly forthright about something, have to remember that I'll then be labeled the angry brown woman at the end of it, you know? And so even when we try and speak up, there are ways that shut us down. And as a result of that kind of way in which politics, and I mean that with a small p, the relationship between people and people plays out, it's very, very challenging to create space for the plethora of experiences to share that space together. And you're right to pick up on a tension in the work, because the tension is there in real life. You know, we have political systems that are either right or left. We have financial systems that are ideologically all about capitalism or going down a socialism or this, that, the other route, right? So our ideologies they are conflicting. And as a result of that, what we build and how we build and who we build for ends up reflecting those changes and those conflicts and those different ideological tracks that things go down. And as a result of that, that's why public space for me is so utterly brilliant as an arena for this, because it is the place in which you can amplify these bones of contention. But I'm always interested in how, when I work with artists, by putting forward certain ideas, they're kind of gentle and slightly haunting and thought-provoking ways to leave that open for people to think about. You know, it's not necessarily about the artwork telling someone off, but it's about whether the artwork can bring someone to a different point of realization. And that for me is really powerful. You know, I don't live in a society in which everybody is equal. I live in a society in which race and class and privilege and access and all those things are quite unequal. So working with these ideas, and this is what I said earlier at the beginning about if you can create something beautiful, and I don't mean that beauty in its conventional sense, but something possible out of an opportunity that I've been given to do something in this space, then it's really beautiful to think of what that possibility could lead to, rather than just creating something beautiful as a band-aid to pretend that there isn't stuff here that's difficult, because there always is. That project in Singapore is operating in difficult territory, but it leaves you to come to a place of realization. The projects for the 70th anniversary of Indian independence, those histories are still very much shaping people's lives. So how do we create the space of acknowledgement and recognition, and for there to be new forms of realization and perspective out of it, rather than trying to deny that complexity is there? And artists, I think, are brilliant at doing that, because they see things. The conversations I have with artists are my most energizing, because we are so excited at the prospect of how we're going to present this idea that we hope will take people somewhere new. We don't know where they will end up yet. We're not saying we're going here. We're just saying we just don't want to be here anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you.
Well, I know we're technically over time, and I don't know about you, but I could probably sit here for another hour talking about this, but that's the public art nerd in me, wanting to fuel the conversation, but I do want to respect others' time and also your time, Mariam, because I know it's past work hours for you. And I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who stayed a little bit later with us. You know, this obviously has been a really captivating conversation and inspiring conversation. Mariam, we kept getting chats throughout this discussion about how inspired people were feeling. And at the beginning of this conversation, our #1 goal is through these workshops is to inspire community and fuel creative conversation, which is exactly what happened today. And we always get this feeling of this is like really exciting creative spark after some of these community convenings that we have. And this is absolutely one of those moments. So thank you so much for sharing your projects. And you know, even though that you are way over in England, so much of what you said today, I think, is applicable to our community. And I think that's where it's our job as people, as residents who care about this, to take away, you know, some really beautiful tidbits from today and see how it's something that we could, you know, realize here in our own communities. And I think we have a lot of really great people who joined the conversation today who can be change makers with us. So thank you so much. Jake,
thank you for the invitation, and I very much look forward to the projects that you're going to do as a community going forward. And please send me links to as and when things are being developed, because I would love to stay in tune with what you're doing.
I know, and I'm going to keep an eye on you if you ever get Matthew Mazzata to do a project with you. I'm so interested. So we've been talking about getting him to come to Summit County for years, but the way that we write our public art RFPs is, anyways, I think we need to be broader about how we define and how we encourage people to think about public art here, and maybe that would inspire him to apply for one of our proposals. We'll see.
Well, I'll see if I can point him in the direction of your RFP when he's here. So
yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for attending as well. It's lovely to see all your names, even if I can't see all your faces.
Yeah. Reminder, this is recorded. I'm going to stop recording soon, but if you want to share this with your friends and family, I'll have it on the website probably by tomorrow. But other than that, we appreciate your time, and feel free to reach out to Jake or I with any questions. My email's on the website, pcscarts.org, and we hope you all have a great day, especially with this inspiring start. So
thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.